Good morning, and thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar, Shifting K-5 Science Instruction with the Next Generation Science Standards Curriculum Adoption. My name is Eric Hoyer, and I'm an Education Policy Analyst here at CSBA, and I will be facilitating today's webinar. Today's webinar will cover NGSS adoption, particularly concerning K-5 curriculum. And we have Peggy Hart, who's an elementary science specialist at the Dixon Unified School District. She's also a fellow at the UC Davis Center for Community and Citizen Science and an instructional coach in elementary science for the Yolo County Office of Education. Peggy, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and welcome, and thank you to all of you who are joining us this morning for this presentation. Like Eric said, my name is Peggy Hart. I've been a teacher for over 20 years, focusing in elementary education and especially focusing on science instruction since the NGSS adoption in 2013. So today we're going to focus on the shifts that are involved and incorporated with the NGSS adoption, as well as some of the instructional shifts that will be needing to be made before curriculum is purchased. So our agenda for today is we'll have a little bit of background on the structure of NGSS, making sure we all have the same vocabulary and understanding going in. We'll look at the instructional shifts for both students and teachers that are incorporated and involved with NGSS. We'll talk about the needs of teachers as we make these changes, shifting our focus from professional development, those 1 or 2 day, 1 or 2 teacher type models, to professional learning, looking at the needs of teachers over time to really shift instruction in the classroom. We'll talk about equity and access as it relates to science adoptions and what it means for elementary adoptions, and steps to determine your district's needs in particular. In California, we have a very wide range of types of districts, and the needs of our students are not the same. And finally, we'll end with questions for you to be able to ask of your team to really make sure that your adoption process highlights the will of the board. So for our basic overview, this is a first grade example of Earth space systems. So if we look at the top of the framework, this first box are called the performance expectations, what some people might refer to as the standards. These are really looking at what students should be able to do with their knowledge. That's one of the big shifts from NGSS. We're no longer looking at just what students should know, but what they can do with their understanding of the current content. Underneath those performance expectations, we have the 3 foundational boxes. If you've heard reference to 3D learning or 3-dimensional learning involved with NGSS, it's referring to these 3 foundational boxes that support the performance expectations. So our first box is the science and engineering practices. There are 8 science and engineering practices, and these are what students are doing to engage in sense making and critical thinking. This is how students are approaching the problems that they're trying to understand. While there are usually 2 or 3 associated with each performance expectation, that in no way means that those are the only 2 that the students will be engaging with, but just the 2 that are highlighted for those particular performance expectations. The next box is the disciplinary core ideas. Those look more similar to what some might refer to as the old standards. So this is what students are supposed to know when they are done with this unit of content. And then the final box are the cross-cutting concepts. These are the dimensions and the ideas that are incorporated across domains. So these are the ways for students to connect their learning from topic to topic and unit to unit. And then finally, down at the bottom, we have the connections to the Common Core Language Arts and Common Core Math. Very similar to the practices and cross-cutting concepts. These are by no means the only connections that students will be making as they engage in scientific literacy, but these are the ones that are more exemplified and highlighted with those particular performance expectations. So the scientific practices in and of themselves are one of the larger shifts that come with the next generation science standards. The scientific practices of asking questions, developing models, planning and carrying out investigations, and so on, are really asking students to take the driver's seat. They are no longer asking students, or excuse me, we are no longer asking students to be passive in incorporating knowledge and content, but we're asking them to engage in critical thinking and sense making as they are the ones in the driver's seat figuring out how to explain different scientific phenomena. So when we think about three-dimensional learning, we're really thinking about how NGSS are different than the old standards, that the students are engaged in the heavy lifting, that they are using their toolbox of science and engineering practices, that those cross-cutting concepts across other domains are their blueprint, making connections to other dimensions, and those core ideas, what they're really taking away from their learning. So if we look at California's instructional materials adoption process, last year we finally got to this bottom row here where the Instructional Quality Commission, or the IQC, made their final recommendation. So the process from beginning to end for California adoptions is usually a fairly lengthy one. But we are now at the tail end as districts really start to look more closely at what instructional materials will support their districts best. So what did the IQC actually look for when they were looking at adopting or recommending curriculum? So they looked at alignment with the California Next Generation Science Standards three-dimensional learning that we just talked about, whether or not they were incorporated. They looked at the program organization. Did it have a logical flow? They looked at assessment. Did the assessments highlight that 3D learning model? They looked at equity and access, instructional planning and support for teachers. But by no means did they look at quality. And that is one of the biggest highlights that we need to focus on, is that while the IQC did look for whether or not these elements were present, they did not look at the quality of each of those elements. So if we look at our timeline, California has been in the NGSS adoption process since the approval of the new standards in 2013. The majority of our timeline over the last 6 years has been spent in that awareness process from April 2014 to June 2017. Those were the statewide rollouts as teachers and districts moved towards more of an awareness and hopefully towards an adoption of the standards before curriculum was adopted. And finally, last spring, we had our operational test of the CAST, and this year we have our adoption of curriculum. So the NGSS implementation pathway looks at the stages that districts have been going through over the last 5 or 6 years. So stage 1 was just initial exposure to NGSS. Most districts spent some time, but again, a lot of districts spent time simply looking at the standards. But moving on to stage 2, deepening understanding of NGSS, and especially stage 3, planning instruction around NGSS, required a lot more time, effort, and professional development for teachers. Most districts in our state are somewhere between stage 2 and stage 3. There aren't as many districts that have made it to stage 4 of full alignment of instruction to NGSS yet. There are shifts embedded within NGSS and especially within the curriculum that you should be looking for as you are looking at adoption. So you should be looking for students to be engaging with anchoring phenomena that elicits their questions that they then go about exploring to help them answer. Lessons are learner-centered, not teacher-centered. We often say, look in your classroom and see who's doing the heavy lifting. It should not be the teacher. The curriculum should highlight that students are the ones engaging in the scientific explorations as a way to make sense of the world around them, and that they are the ones explaining their understanding through various modes, either writing, having discussions, making visual representations. Students are given time to design investigations, to explain phenomena. The key word there is time. These steps and these shifts take a lot more time and instruction. That students are not just engaging in activities that reaffirm an already known outcome. That students have time to engage in scientific discourse, to explain their own ideas, and challenge the thinking of others. The materials support the teacher's facilitation and modeling argumentation, scientific discourse, reaching consensus with a focus on equity and access. And that students see themselves as examples of ones who do science with a focus on inclusion and diversity, that they are not passive in this process. There are also, in addition to content shifts, what we are asking of the students, instructional shifts that are what we are asking of our teachers. So teachers need to shift from teaching discrete facts, the model that most teachers are more familiar with, to being able to facilitate students exploring and explaining a new phenomena using explanatory models. Teachers need to know how to go from teaching teacher-explained content to students exploring and investigating phenomena to come up with their own explanations. From reading and learning about science to engaging with the scientific practices to help them engage in the phenomena. And from assessing students' recall of discrete facts to assessing students using a 3D model, looking at students' ability to explain ideas and argue from evidence. Unfortunately, most elementary school teachers do not feel that they are prepared to take on this task. Most teachers do not feel that they have had enough professional development in how to teach science. And the majority of elementary school teachers also do not feel that their own content knowledge in sciences is deep enough to be able to engage their students in this type of practice. So the question then becomes, how do we support our teachers so that they can best support our students? A lot of research has gone into this process, especially over the last 5 or 6 years as we move towards NGSS full implementation. And the research has shown that a professional learning model that is long-term over professional development of discrete days is what is critical. So professional learning needs to be a continuous process, not a one-day event. Professional learning opportunities should be focused both on understanding the new standards as well as the instructional shifts necessary to implement them. Within districts and sites, teachers will need time for collaboration, working together with an active facilitator to help focus on the instructional shifts within their grade level, as well as vertically and horizontally across grade bands. And professional learning opportunities should be available to all teachers with follow-up, feedback, and reflections that supports implementation of the standards before curriculum is introduced. For districts that are maybe in stage 2 or still moving towards stage 3, that key of before curriculum is introduced might be more of a challenge. If we look at the key shifts from the California framework for science professional learning, we see that we are moving away from the more isolated teacher, the one-day professional development, where that cycle of inquiry into a teacher's own development is not assessed, and moving towards more collaboration, more time for sustained and continuous learning with follow-up and feedback, and time for teachers to reflect on their own instruction. When we talk about equitable access, and I'm going to read this quote from research coming out of the National Academy of Press, to the extent that early experiences in science are valuable in preparing students for future science learning and careers, reducing the exposure to science in elementary school is particularly problematic for students who do not have access to science learning opportunities in their homes and communities. For these students, limiting early science learning opportunities leaves them unprepared for science courses in middle and high school, which can exacerbate future inequities in interest, course, and achievement in STEM. When we look at equitable access in elementary school, one of the focuses is on the amount of time given. When we look at students who do not have access in the home, that time given in school to science instruction and scientific literacy is even more important. So how do we get there? Well, we know that the achievement gap between various demographic groups in STEM subjects continues to be an ongoing issue in California. We know that schools that have limited time for science instruction are often the same schools that serve populations underrepresented in STEM fields. So to put another point on that, the schools that service those underrepresented populations are allocating the least amount of time for science instruction in their classroom. The more time dedicated to science, the more likely students are engaged in inquiry and critical thinking. And when given limited amounts of time, teachers are more likely to revert to old modes of science instruction. If they are only given 15 or 20 minutes in their day, they are going to have a teacher-directed lesson. But when given time, that deeper inquiry happens. Research shows that a robust science program can also be a powerful component to closing the achievement gap. There is significant research about the connection between scientific literacy and literacy in general, and students that have engagement in scientific literacy increase their literacy skills overall. That the shifts necessary for science literacy requires teachers to commit more time to science instruction. The amount of time extended to elementary students is a matter of equity and access. And board policies should reflect a plan to deliver a robust science education for all students. So this is an image from the California NGSS time training. The time training is the toolkit for instructional materials evaluation. There is a process that has been laid out by the state of California and the California Superintendent's Education Services through a collaboration with many of the people in charge of the rollouts to help districts look at the process of NGSS adoption. We're going to focus on this first box, which boards often have more impact in, which is developing the district's lens. So when developing a district lens, first the district needs to identify the stakeholders, including teachers, administration, as well as members of the community. So a committee should be made up of members of the community, the district, and predominantly teachers making sure that everyone who is going to have a hand in NGSS adoption is at the table. You then identify the strengths and needs of your students, your teachers, parents, and community members. You may have access to things that other districts do not, but have needs that are different from districts next door. You need to discuss what your district sees as meaningful forms of science learning and what you want it to look like in your classroom. And what supports might students and teachers require. Those supports need to be identified early on. Then you need to focus on what resources you have available and might need. So what does your district already have versus priorities that you will need delivered by a curriculum adoption? You need to look at what professional development has already occurred versus what professional learning opportunities might be happening either currently, in the past, or ongoing in the future. You need to look at what your model of science instruction is based on the needs of your students, and your curriculum adoption should support that model of science instruction, whether it's going to be a science specialist or taught by the classroom teachers or somewhere in between. You need to identify the materials that may have already been purchased as a supplemental resource. For the last 5 years, those districts moving towards stage 4 may have already adopted or purchased supplemental resources before adoption. You also need to look at your site's data to determine the strengths and needs of both your teachers and your students. So the data from the last cast will be giving us only preliminary indicators, but those scores should not be weighed too heavily. The trends over time in both English language arts and math, as well as historical middle school and high school science scores, will give you a clearer lens into the strengths and needs of your students coming up. You need to look at trends over time, focusing on your subgroups, identifying the unique needs of your district based on the data. So thinking about this process, questions for you to be able to pose to your school boards. What stage is the district in with regards to the NGSS implementation? When we look at our process transferring from awareness to full implementation, you need to be able to articulate as you are thinking about adoption what stage you are in and what needs will be coming with each stage. What has been the focus of professional learning opportunities for your K-5 teachers to prepare them for this transition? And what professional learning opportunities will be ongoing that are already planned? What types of facilitated collaboration? And facilitated is a key word there. Teachers need support in this process to be able to collaborate. What types of facilitated collaboration has been put in place to support teachers in making these instructional shifts? What's the timeline with regards to NGSS adoptive materials in your LCAP? Does your LCAP need to be updated? And what will that impact be on the budget? Currently, right now, the state is not approving new funds for this adoption. So the funding needs to be incorporated into your LCAP. What site level data is being used in developing your district lens? When it comes to Williams compliance, how will students have access to the content at home? And is this method available to all students? And will the district require a change in policy regarding applying for supplemental resource approval? If your district decides not to utilize what has been adopted or recommended by the state of California, will you need to apply for supplemental resource approval? So in conclusion, thinking about the big pictures, big ideas, making the shifts required for a 3D model of NGSS instruction will take time for both teachers and students. The needs of both need to be considered in your planning going forward. Teachers will need professional learning opportunities, not simply professional development, to explore the instructional shifts, as well as deepen their own content knowledge. For teachers to make this transition, they need to feel confident in their own scientific understanding, as well as have practice in the instructional shifts before curriculum has been purchased. Schools may need to change their schedules to allow for equitable time for science instruction. Again, going back to those underrepresented groups, the more limited time for science instruction, the less likely teachers will be to make those instructional shifts. To fully implement NGSS, it will take more than just new curriculum. It will require a shift in the models of instruction. And finally, curriculum selection will be simply a piece in the puzzle in supporting both teachers and students. Thank you all so much for logging in this morning. I wanted to open up the floor to any questions that anyone might have.
Great, Peggy. Thanks so much. Yes, if you have questions, please use the question section of your dialog box there to ask a question, and we will get that answered. Just a couple programming notes. The slides for this presentation and the recording of the webinar itself will be posted in about a day or so. And so we'll a link will be sent out to that usually in our weekly blast about that. And Peggy also has completed a brief on this subject based on this PowerPoint, and that should be out about December or January, and we'll let members know when that's available. And so now we'd like to move to the Q&A section. One question I had already for you, Peggy, is can you give us some examples? You mentioned the difference between professional development and professional learning. Can you give us some examples of some of the longer term professional learning that's out there for NGSS?
Yeah, so in connection, many counties of Office of Education have been looking at lesson studies. Quite a few counties of education have grants going right now where teachers are meeting over the course of 2, sometimes 3 years, developing lessons together, implementing them, trying them out, reflecting on the changes that they've made. There are also quite a few research projects through San Diego. UC Davis has ongoing projects where they are collaborations with districts, County Office of Education, and universities that allow for teachers to grow in their own learning, have time to reflect, implement, and then collaborate with peers as they make these transitions.
Great. Another question we have are about professional learning communities. So can you explain, we hear this a lot, can you explain what this is and what that would look like in a science context?
In a science context, with a professional learning community, it's that idea that teachers have time to reflect on their instruction through the collaborative process with their peers, modify their instruction, and then implement those modifications and reflect on the improvements or lack thereof sometimes that were made. When it comes to NGSS instruction, teachers are going to need this process a little more facilitated, I believe, than with some of the other rollouts. With the science instruction, many elementary school teachers do not have the scientific content background, and they'll need some facilitation in looking at the scientific content and deepening their own understanding so that they feel comfortable opening the floor to students' questions and ideas and explorations, as well as those scientific instructional shifts.
Okay. A question we have here. At the beginning of the presentation, you stated that there were many factors considered during the IQC assessment, but quality was not. And so I think this person is asking what kind of, what did you mean by quality?
Yes. So when the IQC was looking for, let's say, alignment with three-dimensional learning, they looked at the curriculum to see whether or not the scientific practices were called out, whether or not the cross-cutting concepts were noted and highlighted. But they didn't then correlate that to a quality judgment on the lesson. So if, for example, going back to our first grade standard, if they were looking at that first grade standard and the scientific practice is planning and carrying out investigation, and that scientific practice was highlighted and called out, but the actual instruction was more of a traditional confirmation lab where students were not planning or carrying out the investigation, but it was more teacher-led and teacher-directed, that would be something that I would consider more of a quality issue. So while the practice might have been highlighted, the lesson itself, quality-wise, would not facilitate student sense making.
What do you think the principal, I think that sometimes in curriculum adoption, the principal's role often gets overlooked. What do you think the principal's role in supporting NGSS implementation is?
I think there are two very large important roles for a principal that come to mind. The first is the schedule of the school day. So often the principals are the ones in charge of setting their master schedule. If in your master schedule you have set 20 minutes for science instruction, that quality and that equity and access is going to be very limited. The principal needs to ensure that the teachers have time to teach a 3D learning model and quality instruction. The second, I would say, is to know your staff. Not all teachers are going to be as comfortable with the science content, especially as you get into upper elementary and possibly even middle school. Many middle school teachers have been discipline specific, and if your district is now going with a different model, your teachers in elementary and middle school might need content support based on their particular grade level that would need to be incorporated into their professional learning.
Great, and I think this was kind of, you touched on this in your last question, but you know, seeing that you've been a teacher for a while and an instructional coach, how would you engage teachers that are kind of reticent to take on a new curriculum adoption?
I think one of the best ways that I have found as someone who delivers professional learning opportunities for teachers is to give teachers some of the explorations and experiences that we have with our students. Teachers need to be reminded of what that struggle feels like, but also how wonderful that discovery feels when they are able to figure things out on their own. Most teachers, when you show them the benefits of this type of model of instruction and they have the opportunity to experience the instructional shifts as a student, really see the benefit to transferring that to their own classroom.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Peggy. We've come to the end of our questions and to the end of our webinar. As I mentioned, the recording of this will be posted within about a day, and the slides will be up there. The brief based on this subject will be posted to our web probably sometime in December or January. We want to thank members for participating in this webinar. We will be having our next webinar on Monday, September 30th, and that will go over how state standards get implemented generally. So this is not just specific to STEM, but it will be kind of great for board members to see how this process works from beginning to end. So we want to invite you to do that, and there is an invitation out there that you received, I think this past week about that. So thank you so much. Thanks to Peggy, and we'll see you for our next webinar. Thank you.